The next concept that I want to talk about is instrumentation. This is a huge one because if you approach it inefficiently, you can actually end up wasting hours of recording time and hours of mixing time. There are obviously endless ways to go about writing a song. Often we have simple melodies or harmonies pop into our heads. Sometimes they come along with a specific instrument that we want to play those melodies and harmonies, and sometimes it's more ambiguous than that. Regardless, it's important that we consider those melodies and harmonies and the instrument that we want to play each specific part as part of a greater whole. For example, let's say I have a cello part in mind that I want to really be driving the harmony of the song. Okay? And I want that cello to be right up front, very present up front and center, and I want it to sound like this. Do 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 do. Let's say I want to double that cello part with a bass guitar. I want that to be what the listener is focusing on as well. And it sounds like this. Do 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 do. Finally, I want my lead melody to be played by a double bass or an upright bass. And it sounds like this. Do 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 do. What I have so far are the makings of a pretty awful song. But I have a melody in mind and I have harmony in mind. I think you're going to notice pretty immediately, though, what problems you're going to run into here. The first problem, and probably the most obvious problem, is that all of those instruments share a very similar tone, meaning that they're all occupying a very similar space of the frequency distribution for our listener. And when you have several instruments competing for the same tone, something has to give. Either a couple of them are going to have to sit in the background and let one of them cut through, or if you try to make them all cut through and be the center of attention, you're going to end up with just a block of sound that's not distinguishing each particular instrument. So tone is a heavy consideration when it comes to selecting the instruments that are going to be part of your song. It's important to note that I used bass instruments only in my example. It's actually easier to experience low-end buildup than it is to have higher toned instruments conflict with one another. That's because low frequencies just contain more energy than high ones. Therefore, they require more space in the mix to remain distinct. The other thing to consider within that example is what instruments do you want to really stand out and be the center of attention, and what instruments do you want to sit more in the background. Obviously, not everything can be the center of attention at once. You can change the center of attention throughout the song, but for different sections of the song, you really just want to decide on what is the key element here, what's the driving instrument, and what are the things that I don't mind taking a back seat. At the end of the day, one of the best ways to approach this efficiently is if you're working with a band, be sure that they've played these songs with all of the instruments that they have in mind before actually going into the recording session. If it's sounding good in a live session and all of the instruments pair well with each other, then the odds are you're going to get a really good mix out of that song. If you're a solo musician or you're working with a solo musician, I highly recommend making a demo. That's just a less time-intensive recording session where you record all the instruments that you can and pinpoint instrument conflicts at that stage before you've started investing a lot of time in a full production.